Good afternoon, everybody. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our respected keynote speaker, Professor Preeti Rao, for the session on computational musicology, non-Western music. Our session speaker has received her PhD in signal processing at the University of Florida and conducted her postdoctoral research at the University of Illinois. She currently holds the position of professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering at IIT Bombay. Her research areas revolve around speech and audio signal processing, with a current emphasis on music information retrieval and speech prosody. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so the topic of my presentation was going to be on the theme of computational musicology. So musicology essentially is, about studying the music, let's say a particular music of a particular culture. But where we come into the picture is when we try and apply computational tools to the task. Okay. Okay, so across cultures, there are certain universals in music. Okay, so music, of course, has been existent across the globe in many societies, for centuries, probably since the beginning of, human existence. And it turns out that a lot of studies have looked at, okay, what is, of course, clearly on the surface, every culture's music is different and unique in many aspects, but it turns out there are also universals, okay? And one of those universals is that all music always uses discrete pitches. And the discrete pitches, a group of pitches which are used in music are, clubbed into what are called scales. And each scale has typically 7 or fewer so-called notes or scale degrees per octave. Okay? So this is something that's very striking, that, all cultures which have actually probably not even interacted because they are in geographically completely separated position, locations, have, evolved something, like music, which has such a common basis. They also use rhythm. Okay, so the scale part applies to what we call the melody or the melodic content of speech. But another really important aspect of speech is the rhythm or the timing aspect. Okay, and what is the timing aspect? All music uses an isochronous beat. That means there's something about a time grid, an underlying regular time grid that underlies any music. And that beat itself or that time intervals itself are organized hierarchically. Okay, so there is some, at the lowest level, there's one very fast pulse rate. Then some pulses are clubbed into larger intervals and so on. So this notion of time or regularity in timing is another very, universal aspect of music across cultures. Music tends to consist of short phrases, typically 7 seconds long. So it turns out that any kind of music can actually be segmented into units which by themselves sound complete. Okay, so any long song or a long concert or a long piece of music can actually be segmented, and the phrases. So that is probably something. So all these universals have something to do with human cognition and so on. Instrumentation. Now, all of these cultures use both voice as well as instruments. And often they go together. Okay, there is singing by a human, and there could be instruments, or it could be purely instrumental. There are many different performance styles, of music. Okay, so having said that, like I said, we are going to talk more about the music, a particular type of music, and Indian music in particular. So what the outline of my talk will be that to convert, to actually just talk about some of these concepts and how they relate, let's say, to signal attributes and some kinds of measurements that we can do with the signal. So we'll talk about melody and rhythm. Then we'll talk about the typical concert structure so that we get a little bit of understanding of what really goes on in performance. And that, in fact, it links to what kind of interesting questions we can ask that we can try to answer by the analysis of music data. Okay. And music data, as you already heard the talk in the morning, is of many forms, and audio is one of them. The symbolic form is another version. And then, of course, there's also audio, visual, and so on, right? So what kind of questions can we pose? Those questions can only come if we have some sort of understanding of what we are looking at least a high level, right? And then, so part of the talk will all be about identifying interesting problems to work in. And our problems, especially since we are doing what is called empirical work, that is, we are actually studying artifacts such as audio recordings, and we are doing measurements on them. So clearly we need those audio recordings, and that's our data, right? So you can't work and do empirical, research if you don't have access to good data that actually goes with the problem that you formulated, right? And of course, after this, Ajay is going to give a talk about data sets. I'm telling you what we already have, and also, kind of raising your awareness of what really constitutes a data set and how this business of, putting together data sets and identifying problems overall is an extremely interesting theme. Okay, so making music. So actually in our Indian traditions, there is this very interesting classification of instruments based on the mode of sound production. So as you already know that India has contributed a lot to speech science, right? So the whole thing about articulation and phonetics, a lot of that understanding came from, the work of Panini and so on. So similarly, there are some very interesting descriptions or points of view looking at musical instruments. And for example, this refers to, classifies instruments based on their physical structure and the manner in which they are excited. So you have strings, membranes, solids, and air instruments. But it turns out that above all, the human body, which is the vocal apparatus, that is considered the most expressive of all. Okay, so clearly you can see, right, the amount of flexibility we have in terms of making different kinds of, sounds, it far, crosses or far surpasses any given musical instrument, right? There's only so much that a musical instrument can produce, especially in terms of the timbre of the sound. Like we talked a lot about how an instrument is classified, but the human voice produces multiple timbres. For example, every sound you utter, like even a different vowel, is actually a different timbre, right? So the supremacy of the singing voice is characteristic of many cultures, right? And in India, it is particularly true. There's a lot of diversity in vocal music. So even if we talk about vocal music, there's a whole lot of diversity. And it turns out that in India, it's alone, we have a variety of music. So this is only a very high level, and, we can keep talking of genres and subgenres and all that, like we talked, we discussed during, Professor Alluri's talk yesterday. So the music of India, very, very broadly speaking, we say that it was originally folk music, and a lot of our other traditions actually have originated from that. Yeah, please. Yeah, I don't have that term, what it is called. Yeah, like our flute and so on. Right.
The Shunya.
Yeah.
Shunya is a very beautiful thing. Actually.
Right.
Similarly, for music generation, it should be as older than probably the
arithmetic.
tradition. If they have used the word nothing, very beautiful.
Yeah. Or maybe they're talking about the encasing of
Cavity.
Correct, the cavity. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's very, very fascinating. Okay, so we have all these, the folk traditions, which are not even dated. And of course, they are still practiced and so on. But stemming from those we have our classical traditions, which are very theorized, right? So what makes it classical? Because there's a whole body of theory that goes with it, right? And then, of course, we have film music. It's a Bollywood, but of course, all kinds of film music from all parts of the country. Not film, and now of course we also have popular music that does not go with movies. So the two main classical traditions are Hindustani and Carnatic, and they are both united by this theory of raga and tala, okay, which refers to melody and rhythm. Okay, now if we are going to talk about a piece of music, then we have to talk in terms which make sense for music. That is the melody, harmony, rhythm, the texture, which in a sense refers to the timbre, but like, it could be the composite of many instruments playing together. For example, the dynamics, like the intensity variations with time. So all of these are terms that you will come across in discussions about music, right? Now, the music itself, like I mentioned, there are many representations, and like we talked in the morning, so we have the symbolic representation, we got the audio visual, and so on. So all of these are, kind of available for our empirical research, depending on what the research question is. And of course, there are multiple applications. So, we have a lot of, technology applications that we looked at many examples of in the morning. And now, of course, more recently, music generation. And of course, on top of this list, I put what I mostly will be talking about here, which is about analyzing music from the point of view of, a scholarly study about the music and how we can use computational tools to achieve that. Okay, so something very, very basic, like I mentioned about the universals in music, is the existence of scales. Okay, so the scales is a list of all notes that are expected or allowed in a particular piece of music. So in a piece of music, there are certain notes which are allowed. Like we said, music comprises of discrete pitches. So if you were to analyze, for example, a speech signal, you would find the pitch varying almost continuously or equally likely to take a lot of different positions in terms of pitch value, okay, the frequency in hertz. On the other hand, in music, the usage, the pitch itself tends to be discrete. So at any given time, it's mostly the case that the pitch takes on a value which is one from a set of discrete fixed values, okay, or at least fixed for that piece of music, right? And usually music can be transposed. Okay, I said major scales and all, we won't talk about that right now, but just to mention that there are discrete pitches and there's something called scales, and the scale is defined by the set of pitches that is allowed, right? So the scale is named based on the set of pitches. And like I mentioned earlier, most scales have 7 notes. Now, some traditions use something else that's called modes, not just scales. And the mode also is characterized by a set of discrete pitches. But modes actually is a kind of a larger description. So it actually tells you a little more about the piece than just the notes of the scale. Okay, so what they typically say is the mode is something between a scale, which is just a set of notes that is allowed in that music, and a tune which completely describes the melody of the music. Okay, so we'll have something to say about it as we go along. Okay, so what are these different scales? So this is a scale that I think almost everyone is very familiar with. It's called the equal temperament scale. So it's essentially divides the octave, right? So the octave is a doubling of frequency or doubling of pitch into 12 intervals logarithmically. Okay, so if 2 is going to be divided logarithmically into 12 intervals, it's going to be the 12th root of 2, and that is what we call as one semitone. Okay, so 12 semitones comprise an octave, and typically we have something called octave equivalence. That is when a doubling of frequency occurs, it's essentially like the same note. It's extremely similar to the note in this percept of pitch, right, as opposed to its relationship to the other notes that lie between the two over here. There are other scales, and in fact, that's talked about a lot when you talk about different musical cultures. So one other very common scale is what is called the just intonation scale. That is also quite similar. So this shows, for example, in Indian, notation or solfege, the 7 notes of a chosen scale. And this happens to be, a particular scale where the intervals between the notes are defined in this manner. And that comes really quite close to the white keys of the keyboard in this particular instance. Okay, and this scale itself has a really interesting origin. It comes about from the harmonic series. So, for example, if you take the 3rd harmonic of a fundamental, so all pitched sounds have spectra with harmonics, correct? So, a pitched sound with a given frequency, base frequency or fundamental frequency, say F0, would have harmonics at F0, 2F0, 3F0, and so on. if you take those harmonics and fold them back into an octave, right? So 3F0 would actually go to 3/2F0, and that becomes one of the levels or notes on this just intonation scale, 3/2. Okay, so if you keep doing this with the fourth harmonic, fifth harmonic, and so on, you end up getting all the notes of this harmonic scale. So it's a very natural kind of a scale that comes about because of the existence of the harmonic series, because of the physics of strings, string vibration, and so on. Okay, but it's really close. But there's one disadvantage to this harmonic scale, and that is something called transposition is not possible. Okay, or it's very, it does not happen very easily. By transposition is meant, shifting a piece of music that's played in a certain set of notes to start on some other note while retaining all the same steps or the same intervals. Okay, so that is actually considered very useful in music, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of the scales have now all more or less, converged to this equitemperament scale, which actually allows that. Okay, now given this, there is a possibility to derive a large number of scales, and that comes out really nicely in this Carnatic music Melakarta system, where the tonic, okay, so the first note of the scale, the sa, is referred to the tonic and the fifth, that is sa and pa, are actually fixed. And then there are many, many possibilities of getting 7 notes. Okay, so if you look at this very carefully, there are many paths you can take through this. And it turns out that the total number of paths is actually 72. So in theory, there are 72 possibilities for scales, right? So a piece of music can choose a scale, and an entire, concert or a song or something can actually be built by just drawing upon notes of that scale. Yeah. Right. Actually, the reason that the first and the fifth are the most consonant, unison is the same pitch, but the reason that the interval 3/2 is most consonant with that is also got to do with Helmholtz theory. I think, huh? No, not all notes are consonant. So for example, 2 tones, 1 semitone apart are not consonant. Okay. So when we talk about harmony, for instance, it will usually be, like well separated notes, which actually, in the sense of the spectral structure, are such that the maximal number of harmonics are coincident. But if there are 2 harmonics, say 9th harmonic of something and 10th harmonic of something else, if they are very close, it leads to beats. And that's what is associated with dissonance. Okay. So in fact, there are a number of, well, actually, see, all of these scales have come from, the consonance concept. It is very much based on Helmholtz theory of hearing, right? So the note 1 and 3/2, and then if you take 3/2 and go to its fifth, 3/2, and so on, then you end up actually getting all these different notes. So you're generating more consonant notes from the existing set of notes, and then you find that you've actually covered all these 12 notes. Okay. So yes, there is a principle of hearing, and also the physics of strings, and the fact that, periodic sound has harmonics. So it's really nice how all of these things actually explain that. Yeah, please, Joe, if you have to add anything to add to that, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, of course. Right, right. Yeah. He was like, oh, I don't know, what do you call those people who are gifted on many, many, he was a physicist and an acoustician, and I think everything possible. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Don't really always want consonants, because especially if we are looking at, for example, like sad music, and like, or we are looking at jazz where they use the tritone a lot, which is the least consonant of all the intervals in the 12 system, like the 12 note system. Like, you don't always want the
Correct.
most consonant, because sometimes the musical tension requires you to go to a dissonant note. And as sir was also saying about, yeah, so yeah, exactly. So to get, and that mood changes, like in, not just in terms of like dissonance and consonance, but also the evolution of the consonants and dissonance across time, for example, tension, and then resolving that thing.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that comment. And that's why I didn't use any words like pleasant, unpleasant, and so on, because it really depends, on the, type of music. And clearly, all the 12 notes have a role to play. So it actually, the notes themselves spring from this explanation of consonant. But then, of course, in a piece of music, they are all used. Even semitone intervals are used and so on.
The consonant and dissonance is relevant when two tones are playing in tandem. And Indian music is not always harmonic, so it's always in a sequence. Unless the harmonium is playing a resonant note while the singer is singing some other, the sense of dissonance is not always relevant. Because it's not harmonic, so we don't take chords so often.
No, but even then, like, if I'm suppose playing a very, like some story, it will have like notes which are not as consonant with the sa of the target.
But the purpose of the music composition is not to maximize consonants.
Exactly, that's what
Yeah,
I'm
so
saying.
rather
Like,
than for
it will create
Correct.
that tension which
Yeah. So essentially, I think the only thing you can say is that it's very rare to find concentration of pitch at some locations away from these discrete pitches. Okay, you may be transiting through some of these, but it's very unlikely that in a piece of music you'll actually find a lot of, presence somewhere between these notes. Okay, but yes, indeed, all the notes, can be used, and there are many possibilities there. Okay, and in the Hindustani tradition, what is said is, again, is very similar to that. The sa and pa are fixed, and these are the notes. But not to worry, if you follow that part about Melakarta, that's fine. We don't need to mention this. Okay, so what about a concert? So like I said, it's good to understand a little bit about the typical, concert. So this is a Hindustani music concert. So you have the main artist. This is a vocal concert. You will have the tanpura or the drone. And the purpose of the drone is to establish the reference note. So although I showed you the the notes on the piano, this is not meant to say that sa is actually fixed at the middle C or anything like that. It's actually a movable tonic, right? So any note can be sa if you're using a keyboard instrument. If you're not using a keyboard instrument, pretty much any frequency or any pitch can serve as your tonic note, okay? And what is important are those intervals, like we wrote down those numbers for the intervals. That is the pitch ratios or the fundamental frequency ratios. That is what defines the scale. Okay, so that's the job of the drone, to be continuously sounding the tonic of the scale, and incidentally, it also sounds the fifth or the 3/2, the pa of the scale. Okay. Then there is usually a melodic accompaniment, not seen very clearly here, but a harmonium, and in Carnatic concerts, a violin, which kind of shadows the voice. So if the vocalist is singing, the major role of the accompanist is to listen and more or less follow the singer. Then there's also the percussion or the rhythm element. In this case here is the tabla. So essentially, a given concert, the description of the concert will be in terms of which raga is being played, which tells you about the melodic aspect, and which tala is being used, which refers to the rhythmic structure. Okay, so what are the signal characteristics? So if you look at voice, singing voice, unlike a keyed instrument, you will find that the pitch varies almost continuously, right? So this is a spectrogram. These are harmonics, correct? And what you can see over here, there's lots of variation, almost some vibrato-like variation happening, especially if you look at some of the higher frequencies, you can see the fluctuation, right? Then, of course, we have the drone, which is like more or less stationary. It's not completely stationary because there are strings being continuously plucked, right? So it has all these static, relatively static harmonics. The harmonium is a keyed instrument, and therefore you again have static harmonics, but they change when a note changes, right? So here are 4 harmonium notes, for example. And then there is a tabla. Now the tabla is another very rich sound, source of sound. So there are many tabla strokes, and they have their own spectral signatures, okay? So although its job is to supply the rhythmic framework or the timing with the onsets, or when it is struck, it also has a strong timbral contribution. That is the nature of the sound. So for example, K is considered a highly resonant sound. In fact, all of these are resonant sounds. There are also other sounds which are not resonant, which are more noisy. So there's a whole palette of sounds over there, and that essentially the onsets form the rhythmic framework, and the precise rhythmic structure depends on the sequence of strokes. Okay, so now when you put all that together, you get this extremely crowded spectrum, right? Because everything is playing together, right? So if we were to do any music analysis, you can imagine that we would be quite hard pressed to even identify where all those different components of the sound are, or different voices are, the harmonium voice, the singer's voice, the tabla, and so on. So I'm just going to play this, and then I'll show you how we have, what is shown here in yellow is the melody of the singing voice. Okay. Right. Okay, so what you heard was this yellow line on this axis. Okay, so the singer's pitch happens to be around 200 hertz, and this was actually, so the pitch is something I think I'm going to talk about pitch extraction tomorrow. But at this moment, it suffices to say that we essentially analyze the audio in small intervals, what we call frames. So every 10 millisecond, we essentially estimate the dominant periodicity, and that is assigned a value in hertz, and that constitutes a pitch. Okay, so we could hear the singer's voice changing in pitch, and this is all the melody. What happened in between was only the background instruments. So if you want to do an analysis of the melody, one of the first steps would be to get this out of this spectrogram, right? Which happens to be only the fundamental frequency with time. Okay, for example, one interesting analysis you might want to do is to find repeating patterns. Correct. So from the observation of this one-dimensional pitch track, we might find out regions which match in terms of the shape of the segment, in terms of pitch versus time. And they would be the same melody. For example, in this song, when the refrain comes back again, the mukhra, it has the same melodic form, and that is something we could possibly identify from this kind of analysis. Okay, so a music performance, Indian vocal concerts last from several minutes to maybe on the order of an hour or more. And it's considered, music is of course organized sound. So melody draws from the discrete pitches, rhythm draws from an underlying temporal grid, and so on. And there are stages of a concert. Okay, so the stages of a concert, in the sense the concert evolves. So it's like a long story from the beginning to the end. So you have these gradual exposition, development. Eventually, there's something that ends in something that's fairly fast-paced. And the large-scale organization of a concert, you can guess from the words that we have used here, acceleration and so on, they really depend on the tempo. Okay, so the rhythmic organization is also quite important to a concert. It tells you what's going on when, and it's an important description, about the concert. So in all our concerts, we have many different instruments. We have many artists and playing styles. There are many ragas, of course. But there is some strong similarity in what we call the concert structure. Okay? For example, if you look at Drupal, one of the ancient forms of Indian music, they don't have an accompanying melodic instrument. On the other hand, here's a vocal concert with, again, the Pakvaj is a percussion instrument, it's playing the role of tabla, but it's more like the mridangam. And of course, you have the tanpura. And then there are instrumental concerts where the lead instrument, it's a lead instrument and not a vocal. And again, we have the percussion and the drone. So the structure of a concert, for example, a Drupad concert, and this also applies to instrumental concerts. So it's quite striking that there is a long initial portion which is unmetered, in the sense it does not have any kind of rigid timing. It's considered mostly improvised, and that itself is segmented into slow, medium, and fast portions. Okay, so this is called alap, and that itself is segmented alap, proper, jod, and chala, where the pulsation increases as you move from section to section. And after that, the percussionist comes into the picture, and then there's a proper rhythmic structure, and there is a bandish, which is a song or a composed song, or a gat, which is also refers to composition, but in instrumental music. So this is a concert structure. So this can last for an hour, out of which this could last for maybe half or more of the time, and this would be played in the second half. So if you look at a CD cover, or what used to be available as CDs, and of course now I think the metadata has even become more scarce because everything's all over the internet and there's no regulation on metadata. But you would find, some information like this, that, okay, this artist is a Drupad artist. They're performing in this CD a concert in the raga Malkauns. So this is a particular raga. So this raga has particular notes and also some other descriptions, that apply to the raga. It has alap, jod, jala for 46 minutes. That's what it's telling us. And there are two compositions. Each of them is being set to a different tala. That is a different rhythmic cycle. One is a 12-beat cycle and one is a 10-beat cycle. And here are the accompanists and their instruments. Okay, so this is the high-level description of concert. So you notice over here, for example, it's not telling you the timing of each of these. They're just telling you that the whole initial alap part lasts for 46 minutes. So these are some of the things that we can actually analyze by looking at the recording. For example, if we understand that these sections are being discriminated mostly based on rhythmic structure and tempo, we could go and do an analysis of the rhythm from the audio and come up with, actual detailed characterization of each of these segments. This is from a Khyal concert. It's very similar. It's telling us that in this CD, there was this raga. There are actually two ragas performed on the same CD, two concerts. One of them is Deshkar. This was the name of the composition. It was first played in medium tempo with this tala. Then there was another composition played in the fast tempo and so on. So tempo is being constantly referred to. Raga is mentioned. So that's where the melodic and rhythmic elements are, provided. Okay, so music information retrieval, there's a whole lot of things. Like we've also seen examples in the last few talks. There's automatic music transcription, recommendation, then all kinds of tagging, music summarization and thumbnails. For example, the refrain of a song could act as a thumbnail. So the example I gave you earlier of finding the motif, it could work for an application like this. And then finally, of course, what we are mainly going to talk about is how do you analyze music for musicology studies, that is doing, scholarship about the music itself. Now, in any of these, the problem statement and the computational tools are actually culture dependent. You can imagine, right? Because we are using different terms. The underlying concepts of melody and rhythm at a high level are more or less the same, or are maybe at a low level are more or less the same. But very quickly, the terminology changes and so on, depending on the culture. So, that's the importance of trying to understand a little bit about the music so that you know better how to pose, specific problems and what kind of tools to apply to them. Okay, so in identifying tasks, there are, this is a very nice table from a musicologist who says that, okay, we can, do all of these kinds of analysis, top down, bottom up, and critical analysis. For example, raga and tala identification would be considered top down. We would search audio recordings for, let's say, motifs and so on. Bottom up would be, we don't know what we are looking for, but we are looking for repeating patterns, right? That's also an interesting problem, because after having identified those patterns or rather discovered those patterns, maybe you're going to find out something about the music that you were not, explicitly aware of earlier. And then, of course, there's something called critical analysis, where you are exploring the gaps between theoretical concepts and practice, right? For example, there are many things said about each raga, but what really happens in practice? That's going to help us understand those so-called theoretical concepts better. And that would be useful. For example, we could improve music theory by testing it against practice. Now, talking a little bit more about the last point, I think, at least one thing that I found very interesting is everybody agrees that Indian music has this very heavy duty theory. Theories are a very important part of Indian musical traditions. And in fact, it's recognized, globally as a very sophisticated tradition because of the theory. There are many texts and there are many treatises, right, from centuries ago. But it turns out, as was very aptly put by this professor from IISc, who reviewed a lot of Sanskrit texts that discuss music theory to find that there is a very large technical vocabulary, but many terms are vague and not quantifiable, right? So he was trying to look for consistency and trying to draw from all of these theoretical treatises some universal understanding about, Indian music. So this is a gap which actually can be filled with empirical studies. So we can actually take audio and we can do all these measurements on audio or empirical research on audio, and we can fill in the gaps. In the sense, vague and not quantifiable terms can actually be can be quantified, right? And we can do this with our computational tools. So we do pitch analysis, rhythm analysis, and so on, which, can actually help us, understand these technical terms better and, maybe get more insights in the process. Okay, so for example, one example of an exercise would be how to tell the key of a piece. Now, key is a Western concept, but like I said, we don't have to reinvent everything. There are a lot of tools available that have been applied to Western music, and the good thing would be to try to understand the relationships and apply those same tools. So this key in Western music is about there are people who are highly trained who can identify the key. So essentially what they're identifying is those basic 7 notes that are used in that piece of music, right? Not just the notes, but the way they tell that is not by exhaustively listening for which notes are played, but more or less from the dominating notes and the notes which are not being utilized and so on. That's the kind of listening that goes on in order to tell the key, right? So there's been one very powerful, very sort of, widely, recognized method for finding key by finding what is called a cognitive template. So for example, if you take all the major keys, which is all the white notes from C to C, it turns out that the pattern in terms of the occurrence of each of those notes is more or less fixed for any piece in the major key. Similarly, for any piece in the minor key, again, this profile, which is like a distribution, right? So a lot of this note occurs, but very little of this note occurs, and so on. That's the interpretation of this plot, right? The tonic, which is the most highly found, have highest occurrence, and then the other notes have less occurrence. But again, there's a very detailed pattern here. So this tells us that if we could take up an audio and we could measure the occurrence of the different discrete pitches, we could get a template like this, and this template would help us identify the key. Yeah, so I'll be talking about raga just after this, about how it relates to this. So an equivalent question would be how is the occurrence of pitches related to the raga, or how can you tell the raga of a piece, right? This is about the key. Yeah. No, there's a lot actually, but all of that actually, this key is like the closest, one of the closest Western music, concepts or tasks that relates to that. Yeah. No, major, minor are also, it's like some of our ragas. These are modes. So these are 2 different modes or 2 different scales, but actually there are, in the Western music case, a lot of scales come because in Western music, even the starting note, contributes to the identity of a scale. Yeah, but I just talk about ragas in very shortly. Okay, so there is an algorithm for key finding which computes what is called a pitch class distribution, right? So what is a pitch class distribution? It's a 12-dimensional vector, right? Where each element of the vector is the strength of a particular note in a piece. For example, strength could be interpreted as the amount of time that is spent on that particular note in a music piece, right? So what is a piece of music? Let's look at only monophonic single line melodies. It is like a sequence of notes. So if you take a whole song, for example, and find the frequency of occurrence of all the notes, and you set up what is called a pitch class distribution, it would be a 12-dimensional vector because we would look at octaves, right? The higher octave is supposed to be identical. We would just fold it back, into that. So we would have only 12 unique, notes that we are looking at, or 12 unique positions that we are looking at. And that could be useful for finding the key, right? So this algorithm, which stems from the work of Krumah and Searle, actually uses this template to find keys. Okay, yeah. Right. So, no, so it's actually, yeah, but the symbolic representation also captures the timing, right? So timing is there everywhere. So you could make it like, for example, in this example, they've done it from the score, right? So they found out, no, chromogram is from the audio. Now there is no audio, there is only a score. Yeah, right. So if you play this, for example, on a piano or sing this, then we could take the audio and then generate the chromogram and find these pitches. Correct. So if you're doing this from audio, you would do a pitch analysis of the audio or a chromogram. The chromogram is another way to get to the pitch, which is, it doesn't really nail down the pitch exactly, but it's very good, especially if there is harmony and so on, or there is some other difficulty in getting to, exact pitches, because it's just not a single note. But it's the same principle. Okay, so coming to ragas, so the musical characteristics of a raga, again, a choice of notes, like we said in this case of scale, and their order and their hierarchy, right? So the hierarchy, again, refers to that pitch class distribution, where some notes are more frequent and some are less. So some are more important, some are less important, some are never used, right? In the scale. But there are some more descriptions to a raga, compared to what we saw for the Western scale. That is the precise intonation and ornamentation of specific notes. So how a note is realized, it's not enough only to specify its interval, but also exactly its pitch contour. That's what is meant by intonation and ornamentation. And then, of course, there's also another temporal, thing like what is called a pakkad or a motive. Any raga will be characterized by a set of phrases that are supposed to be a description of the raga, right? So they are what are called the characteristic phrases. And of course, there are many extra musical characteristics such as affect, what emotion or mood it's supposed to evoke, the time of the day, the season, maybe a lot of folklore associated with the raga and so on, right? These are something that you can imagine being doing from audio analysis, right? So that's why I've listed them separately from this, at least at the moment. Okay, then very briefly on Tala, and of course, I think, Ajay will probably be able to tell you more. So I already said that main percussion instruments, Tala is it's a repeating pattern. Rhythm comes in cycles. And Tala positions, for example, you can divide a cycle if certain cycles such as a 16-beat Teen Tal cycle is divided. And these are the tabla strokes corresponding to that into sub-segments of 4 beats each and so on. So this tells us something about the rhythmic cycle, and the melody is actually something that occurs within the rhythmic cycle, right? So they go together, and that's why we say obviously melody contains timing. Rhythm can occur by itself. For example, drum solos are purely rhythm; they're not considered melody, but melody always has rhythm, right? Because you can't say I sang this note in a song. It has to be a song note with a duration. And a sequence of notes, each of them with their pitches and durations, actually comprises a melody. Okay, so how is a raga described? So from what I wrote down, this happens to be what is called a pentatonic raga. It has only 5 notes. So a raga can have typically up to 7 notes. But in this case, it's just a 5-note raga. So it only uses these notes of the 12 possible notes in an octave. This is what is called the Arona Arona, which Professor Srinivas was referring to just now, which tells you that in ascent, this is the combination of phrases which occurs if it is going to be, the ascending line is going to be sung. So these are more or less like allowed combinations. Then there are phrases, and then there is something called Vadi Sambhaji, refers to the hierarchy, right? What we talked about in the PCD, the most important note and the next note in hierarchy. And then there are certain remarks like this: natural shrutis, which seems to imply that there is some just intonation-based realization of these three notes. Yeah, so these are the different aspects that I just mentioned. They're called the different. Then phrases is something we would call structural descriptions. We would call these important, not important, less important, and all that as something to do with the distribution, and the sequences as something to do with the structure. Okay, so now what is really interesting is when you compare two ragas. So these are two ragas which the same tonal material, right? So they have the same notes. You can see. And obviously, it requires much more description in order to discriminate these ragas, right? So if you look at the more detailed description, you will find there are a lot of differences, correct? For example, this tonal hierarchy itself has changed. So have the phrases. And then finally, the detailed intonation. So we could call this an intonation that it tells us that although the notes are the same, right? These intervals are the same, but in this raga, they are realized as higher shrutis, by which is meant that they are all intoned slightly higher than the notes of this raga. Okay. So now this is what you would find in a musicological text or in a textbook, or all the people who sit for music exams would really know all this very well. But what we could do, for example, is do audio analysis, and a lot of it was actually Kaustub's PhD thesis. He worked extensively on some of this analysis, and we found that we could actually quantify some of these differences. So what is higher, or what is meant by a different, or what is meant by the brackets here, which actually is interpreted by musicians as touch notes. Yeah, you were saying something? Yeah. Right, but what I talked about so far was only the first order distribution. Okay, but of course, if you're talking about sequences, then we have to go to higher order distributions, right? Who knows how many notes they're dependent on, right? So yes, that is something we would learn. We could learn from the data and find out how much context you need in order to predict the next note, right? Yes, so sequential, yes.
And they just sing the Arohana and Avrohana the right way, there itself it creates a mood.
Correct.
Amazing, amazing. Maybe I don't know. You are expecting comment. Arohana, Avrohana,
Right.
creates a mood.
Yeah.
If it is so, I mean, the differentiation between ragas, etc., finer aspects. When it comes to mood, is a very, very basic thing for a raga.
Right. But that's what they also associate specific moods with specific ragas. So, you know, how the phrases are realized, all of those things contribute. Okay, so that's what we talked. And in fact, these ragas are considered, that they can be confused, mainly because one of the very important, characteristics are completely shared. For example, the notes are completely shared, right? So these distinctions then become really important. And, so it's very interesting to know, okay, what do these really mean and how much is the distinction, all of which can be actually analyzed, and this vagueness can be removed about the differences, right? So it's just an illustration of the kind of work possible. Okay, so how do you compute this PCD? So we can do the PCD, for example, just singing sare. You can see that because it's singing, it's, it's not exactly on the grid, but you can still collect the pitch values, the instantaneous pitch values every 10 milliseconds, and you can set up this distribution, right? So this distribution tells us, for example, that the re note was the longest in this short piece, and these two notes were rather short. But it also tells you that there were also some other value, 10 mil every, frame level values, which were between the notes, correct? But eventually, the distribution, you find it has strong peaks, which is consistent with the statement we made that music essentially uses discrete pitches. So it's a way to discover the notes by computing this pitch class distribution. Okay, so I won't go into the details of the computation except to show that this is true. So this is a very nice distribution from IIT Madras master's thesis, which shows that now again the details are missing. I'm not sure that this was also singing, but it shows that in Indian music, the distribution peaks tend to be a little broad. And I think that's something that we would agree could happen simply because in Indian music, there is, the intonation is different. changes the articulation of the notes and the ornamentation. Actually, we end up spending time between pitches also. So all of that contributes to the broadness of the peak, but nevertheless, there are these peaks, and the peaks can actually be named by the notes of the underlying scale. Okay, now you would say that, okay, that's very fine. We, have all these peaks, and if we could do a note labeling, right, then we would come to know all the notes, and then it would be very easy to do all kinds of studies and modeling of the sequence of notes, right? But note labeling is a notoriously difficult task for Indian music, and you can see over here, right? There are so many doubtful cases. Like, for example, I'm not sure I have time to play all this, but what we found is that if we label this note, for example, G, rather than mo, it sounds completely off key. So which is really strange, because this mo is much closer to G line than to mo line. Okay, so its proper labeling is actually quite different from what you could get by just proximity to the underlying notes. And it turns out that to label the notes, typically even musicians don't really label notes. What they do is to label phrases. Okay, so if musician who knows raga well knows that dhani dhapa is a phrase, so it's a composite. And then the segment marking is easier to do for phrases. And actually to segment each note, it's probably not possible, or even if it is, it's unlikely that even musicians will agree on where each note starts and ends, whereas phrases are more recognizable entities. Okay, so this is only about the PCD and how we actually begin to see the difference between those two ragas that we discussed, where one of them has a very low occurrence of re, which is strikingly different from the other raga, both of which share the same notes. Okay, I'll just go a little faster now because I'm going to be out of time otherwise. So we could do a lot of interesting exercises. We were able to actually use that template, the pitch class distribution figure that I showed, to actually look at concerts and identify them, for example, as belonging to Deshkar or Bhupali based on template matching with these references. Okay, so it's possible to do quite reliably. And that is, of course, at the level of a concert. And then if you look at a concert in more detail and break a concert into smaller segments and do the similar analysis, what we find is that adherence to the raga template is actually much better in the initial part of the concert rather than the latter part of the concert. So this is an ROC, which actually talks about the discrimination. When did we achieve the best discrimination between the ragas, between concerts in these two ragas? We found that if you consider a segment of the concert away from the beginning, it tends to be more difficult to discriminate the ragas compared to the beginning. Now, that's also something that all musicians know, right? Because they start the concert with trying to communicate the raga to the audience. And once they've captured, the audience and they're all in the same frame, they tend to take more liberties, right? So these are some of the things that we can quantify now looking at this. And what is quite interesting is also to look at the same pitch class distribution, but on the time scale of a rhythmic cycle. That is, we look at small segments that are defined by the rhythmic cycle. And we see that the same performer on two different occasions performing the same raga actually took different trajectories, right? So it tells us something about the improvisation element. As far as the two performances, they are probably named in exactly the same way. But on the other hand, there are a lot of differences in details which now become visible because of the computational analysis. Okay, and then of course we could look at the phrases and we could try and understand what is meant by these distinctions. So when a re note is placed in brackets, it means it is only slightly touched and not elongated like over here. And then we can do duration measurements to find out what that difference is. And once again, we could also look at the intonation. Okay, so all of these things are quantifiable and can lead to some really interesting results. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this. I already talked about motive. Okay, so another thing is there's lots of variability. So although we are talking about this raga, and we also talked about the difficulties of labeling notes because of the continuous variation of pitch, it turns out that even for the same phrase, there is lots of variability in the melodic contour, right? The pitch contour. So for example, this is from a single concert extracting a particular phrase, dha, ga, pa, right? And you can see it says it is dha, ga, pa, and that's what a musician would label this by. But if you looked at it, it has so many parts. It has some kind of oscillation here. It has a flat note, another touch note, and then a very slow glide, and another flat note, and a glide, and so on. But all the repetitions of dha, ga, pa actually end up looking quite the same. But of course, if you look very fine, there are also variations, right? So for example, there are duration variations. Some of them are compressed, some of them are long, and so on. Okay. So what is characteristic and what can be used to discriminate phrases is not the fact that dha, ga, pa, because they have so much more detail than one would imagine just writing 3 notes dha, ga, pa would look like. But on the other hand, there's a huge similarity in this within raga, and this happens to be within consort. But even if you look at another consort in the same raga, you will find dha, ga, pa has this kind of characteristic shape. Okay, so there are a number of interesting things you can do with this. Yeah, I don't think I have time. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go to the next presentation. I want to talk about 2 applications, of this kind of work. So I just need to close this presentation and open the next one. I don't know, Parampreet or someone can just help me on this laptop. Where are the other presentations in this laptop here? I think he showed it to me, but there's so many things open that I can't make out. Yeah, just you can close this and open the next one. All right. Yeah, just open the notation. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so this is another piece of work that we've just started doing, and it's about this transcription problem. So the transcription problem is something we talked about, but in the case of Indian music, it's a little bit difficult to define for all the reasons I mentioned, right? We saw the notation was dha, ga, pa, but we had so many peculiar shapes and forms in that melodic contour, correct? So what do we mean by the transcription problem? And what do we want to do with that transcription, right? We have an oral tradition where music is taught by the teacher singing by example, by teaching by example, by singing, and the student imitating, and then finally internalizing everything. So what do we really want to do? But if you look, there's a whole lot of, the use of notation is still very much there. People do take down notation, and there's also some general understanding. So I just play this video. Okay, so it's fairly common to find teachers. What is she doing really? She is singing the song and then she's trying to break it into its sargam by, and so the notes are being used as some sort of a mnemonic. So maybe, a student can take down those notes, or they begin to see the shape of the contour a little more easily than just by listening to the singing. Okay, so this is the notation that we would like to get, correct? So this is what we call a schematic notation, and it can be used in the teaching and practice of complex sequences, right? Complex contours, melodic contours. Okay, so now if you look at this, one of the widely used notation is called the Bhatkande notation. And there are a large number of traditional compositions that have been notated like this. Okay, so what is this notation? This is from a book. It's not even in machine readable form. It is showing us on one line the notation, that is the sa, sa, ma, ma, and so on. That's the notation. The last line is the lyrics, right? The words of the song. And on top are some qualifiers. So sa is not sung just as plain sa, but there's also a touch of ni, for example. That's what it's telling us, right? And this is the rhythmic boundary. So these are the 4 sub-cycles of the main cycle. So the idea is, can we take an audio and arrive at this Bhatkande type notation? Okay, so why is this so challenging? So Bhatkande notation, there are a lot of bandishes or compositions that use Bhatkande notation. And it's is still considered skeletal framework. You can't pick up a book and start singing. You really have to know the raga very well before you know how to interpret that notation or what the exact pitch realization is of all those notes written over there. Okay, so how is it related to the automatic music transcription problem? Well, it is similar in the sense we are trying to get to a symbolic form, right? Except the symbolic form looks different. It is in the form of sargam and not in the form of these Western style notes. Okay, but there's still the sequence of notes, and there's also a timing grid, right? Like we saw in the previous this thing. This is the timing grid, correct? So this ma with a dash indicates that this is occupying 2 beats, whereas this ma and this ma are a single beat each. Okay, so we have timing and we have this ma which tells us which pitch it is or which note it is. So it's quite complete actually. Okay, so we came across this really interesting thesis by I think he's I don't know whether you know him. He's from Rochester, but he's a music professor. In 2011, who spent a lot of time in Chennai, and he actually, took some of these and he did transcription. So, the way the musicians do transcriptions is they sit down with the headphones and they listen very closely, and they even try and slow it down so that they can write all the detailed notes. So he took this Vanajaksharo, which is a Carnatic composition, which has this skeletal schematic notation. So on the surface, this is the song, sa, sa, sani, so on and so forth. But when he actually did a transcription, he wrote all these little notes, right? So this is, according to him, a very detailed transcription. So he did this for several compositions. And then he found, okay, he took a particular rendering of this, and then he wrote down all the different forms of a given nominal note, right? So you take only the note ni and you write down the transcription of all the ni which occurred in that song, right? And the same for dha, and you can see the amount of variations he found, right? So what are these? These variations are actually all of the detailed articulations or the detailed intonation of all those notes. Okay, so that tells us how difficult this notating problem is, because there are so many different melodic contours associated with the same ni note, correct? So if we want to do this notation finding problem, we have to be able to, cluster these together to the same note. Okay, so to do this, and then there are some really nice books which also have a lot of transcriptions, because, a lot of Western musicians who studied Indian music, their first urge or itch is to just transcribe it, okay, which there's not a lot of interest in Indian music to do that. So there are these 2 volumes called the Songs of Khyal by Nicholas Magriel, and there are 2 volumes full of this transcription where he has used Indian notation but put very detailed breakups of the notes to make it like a transcription. Okay, finally, this is what the pitch contour looks like. This is what we want to get. But this is something you can get by this process of transcription by actually writing down literally where the pitch is at any given time. Okay, so that just shows you, the gap that we have to bridge in going from something like this, which we can measure quite easily, to going to something like Bhattacharya notation. Okay, so the processing involves, pitch tracking and onset detection. I think that's something we could not cover today, but I think Professor Jha is going to cover tomorrow, how you can track beat and onset and so on. But once you have that, you can get the grade, you can get the notes and so on. And then, of course, we need some heuristics or some deep learning or something in order to make that, to go from the pitch contour to okay, so that was just an example of a song, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the song and okay, so if you do all that, the beat tracking and the pitch tracking, then you should be able to get a contour. So this is a pitch contour, and then these are the onsets because there's tabla accompaniment, right? So the presence of tabla makes it relatively easy for us to find the onsets. Otherwise, you would have to find them from the syllables of the lyrics. Okay, so once you have this and you have this, you could do something extremely naive, and you could just find the nearest note by taking the majority of the pitches in that interval and assign it. So you get sa, sa, dha, pa, ga, re for whatever we heard so far, right? So this is just something that we call mean value based notation. You can see it has made a number of errors. So we just took the mean of each temporal pulse interval and we assigned it to the nearest grid node, right? So we got something that's, got a number of errors. We could try median and so on, but ultimately what we really need to do is to look at larger contexts and, use some sort of either learning from data or some more detailed heuristics to come up with those notes, right? Okay, any questions on this before I change to the next? Okay, I need to open the next one now, if I can find it. Yeah.
Yeah, any other way other than like in languages,
Yeah.
we have bigram, trigram representations. So instead of this unigram, the terminology we can use for this notation. Maybe Indian music requires a bigram or something like trigram.
No, certainly, yeah.
So we can, instead of saying that it's very complicated, we don't know how to collapse it into unigram. You can say that we need for this raga, there are too many trigrams.
Correct. No, that's what I meant by
Sufficient.
correct. No, that's what I meant by context. So you need a lot of temporal context, which is similar to saying that you need bigram, trigram. So you need to know something about.
They become the units actually.
Correct. Like the phrases become the
The
units.
Arohana and Avrohana has the unigram
Right.
anchors.
Correct.
But then based upon that, we should define that this raga requires
Right.
so many. I mean, if you just take Arohana, which has got 5 notes, so instead of 5 5s are 25 bigrams. So we can say that there are 16 bigrams that are used in this raga. There are 3 digrams that are used in this raga. So we can say specifically and use that as a notation. And instead of mapping ourselves to the Western notation, you can think of a different syllabic form.
Right. So here the complications are 2. It's not just about the, those occurrences, but the intonation of each note is different. Like I showed you the Morris work, which he has found 16 forms for ni alone in a single song. So, yeah. Right.
It doesn't have a far back to the different bigram. I mean, just explain from far.
Right.
We have something of that sort which we can talk offline.
Right.
Dictionary of all possible biograms with function to
Correct. No, what I'm trying to tell you is that's already incorporated. That's already a part of it. In addition, there are these other, non-unique mappings, but that's extremely important part of it, looking at higher order grams. I mean, it's almost essential to take that route. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because mean is a little too arithmetic oriented. It's not why, so the median is the most frequent occurrence, right? So you can think about it perceptually. You're not going to be going around calculating arithmetic mean, right? When you're listening. So, right, beat. Yes. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right. So the mean may not occur at all. Of course, in this kind of continuous variation is going to occur somewhere, but maybe very rarely. Yeah. Right.
So the question is, you mentioned that you were trying to transcribe the abstract notes, right? Each abstract note corresponds to many different forms.
Correct.
And then later you talk about the pitch contour transcription, the detailed pitch contours. I don't see the link between these two.
Right. No. So the detailed pitch contours were, the examples I showed were all done by Western musicians who did what they call music transcription. So what they did is to actually, write out the entire form in terms of the nearest sequence of notes. So they broke up the detailed, continuous shape into as many segments as needed as to write a note value for each.
Okay.
But that's not what happens in our schematic notation.
I see. And then you need another step to convert.
Right. Now, it's not clear whether that intermediate step is needed, but that one we can get to relatively easily. But again, that we don't know how to go from that unless we do, like was mentioned, we use some higher, contexts and, some sort of learning.
So from the document annotation of the
Right.
abstract notes, do
Yeah.
you see any consistency or pattern?
Right. So that's what we try to, we just did something very simple like the mean and the median in the beat, and that makes a lot of errors. So there needs to be more than that. So something so local won't do. So that's where we probably need to bring in the context of the whole phrase, maybe the whole phrase shape or something like that, or maybe learn larger units which go together. It's like, contextualizing and saying words and phrases instead of single phones.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Speech.
Right.
Go back.
Go back to the, yeah. So the constraints have to come from some higher order higher units.
Okay.
But a lot of Indian musicians will write the Indian notation straight away. They don't do that transcription, the so-called detailed transcription. Yeah, they don't do the intermediate step, but they have so much of knowledge and understanding beforehand that they're able to just write out. It's like they know the language, they can write the words. But if you talk to someone in a foreign language, you're not going to be able to write any words, right? You can only write maybe the sounds. Yeah, the lyrics are not important to the transcription. No. No. It can be hummed also. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, everybody wants to sing songs with lyrics, but you can even sing in akar or hum it and you will still get the same notation if you sing it properly. Right? So there's no one-to-one correspondence between the lyrics and the notation. Hmm? Yeah. Lyric aksharas they come from the words and the semantics of the, whatever the song is about. Yeah. Okay, so finally, I just want to give you an example because we also talked about multimodal in the morning and we looked at these nice examples of violin transcription with the help of gestures, right? You're able to disambiguate, the precise motion or the precise nature of the vibrato by looking at the gesture or the movement of the, the musician's hands. So this is a work that we are doing on sound and gesture relationship, but although there are associations in playing an instrument, like we saw with the violin, but we are looking at vocal music. Okay, so what's the gesturing with vocal music, right? So vocalists in Indian classical music traditions are known to use a wide range of manual gestures. So we are all familiar with that. When you see a musician, they often move their hands. And we also do that in speech, right? Here I'm busy gesturing while talking, correct? Although I have not explicitly learned, nor have you learned that when I do this, I mean this, and so on. Similarly, with music is even less understood, right? And it has no one-to-one correspond. They're going to produce the same sound, whether they move their hands this way. So there's no direct link, correct? So we study the possible complementarity between gesture and melodic movement. By melodic movement in Indian music, all sung music or any music is viewed as traversing melodic space, right? You're moving in pitch space. So those movements, are they connected with the hand movements? Correct? Okay, there has been some work, a lot of musicologists have studied gesture. They said some of it is to synchronization, like in Carnatic music, there's always, musicians often tap with the beat, so that's a kind of a gesture. But we're talking about other kinds of gesture where they're not necessarily using it for keeping time, but possibly they are going with the melody, right? So sound gesture relationship in the context of Carnatic music. So we would like to do some computational studies because this is the work done by musicology. Can we use vision and audio signal processing techniques to understand this better, right? So we have this data set again to tell you how important data sets are. You can't even work on a problem. So this was actually collected at Durham University in the UK by Professor Clayton, who is a very prominent North Indian music scholar. These are audio-visual recordings of concerts they were connected by 3 cameras so that you get complete 3D information. And these were short sections of alap singing. Okay, so alap is the early part of the concert, no percussion, nothing. Singer is singing by himself, no timing to be kept. So it's very ideal for that. So here is a snapshot of the singers and just video stills. 9 ragas were chosen by the musicologists to illustrate some diversity in the types of melodies. And then this hand tracking was done. You can see that the wrists were tracked, right? You can even track elbows and shoulders and so on. So we use open pose. These are the skeleton tracking software, similar to what we saw in the morning. Okay, here is a video snippet of that.
निषाद मटंगे राग श्री पकड़ रे रे प मा प ध ध म ग रे प रे ग रे सा.
Okay, so you can see how much movement there is, and it seems to go with the singing. And possibly something you might have noticed is how he sometimes pauses, and it happens at the end of a phrase and so on. So the whole idea is, can we link the visual gesture movements? If you look at these movements in terms of the pitch contour, here we just show the pitch contour, that is F0 versus time in the log scale, and the gesture coordinates of the 2 wrists. Okay, so 2 wrists of left hand and 2 wrists of right hand, these become one-dimensional trajectories, right? So these are time series. So this is a problem of linking the gesture time series to the audio time series, which is F0 versus time. Okay, so that's the problem that we were looking at. So we've done some work since then, but this was some work we did right in the beginning where we extracted some features from all the different time series, and then we tried to do raga classification with only the audio time series, only the visual time series, and then using the audio visual time series. Okay. And yeah, so this is all not very important, but we had, various kinds of processing for the video inputs and the audio inputs, and then we had to look for some way to combine them finally. So we get very high audio recognition of raga from, these are 12-second clips. We can recognize the audio, the raga with high fidelity. If we use audio alone, very poor with video. You can imagine, you've turned off the audio and you're only watching the singer, and then you have to guess the raga, right? And this was 9 ragas, so it's not terrible, 36% recognition. But if you have not seen the singer, so if you train on you don't train, you use a test singer who is different from the training singers, then you get very low detection with video, as can be expected. Okay. But when we combine the modes, we found that there is at least one method of combination which gives a boost in terms of getting higher accuracy. Video gives you 35, audio 82, but you can get 3% increase over audio by bringing in video, which went to say that the visual information is actually brings some value to the raga recognition problem, by which is meant the discrimination of those contours, right? So using the 2 time series seems to give you some information. So here we actually just show how audio and video prediction together gives some small boost. So yeah, this will take a while to decode. So I'll just show you the confusion matrices. So video predictions by themselves are quite poor. Audio are quite good, but they get better. So it's got a little more cleaned up when you go to audio visual predictions. So we saw, for example, that there were some ragas like Bahar and Miyaki Mallar who have very similar tonal material. So audio-wise, slightly confusing, but it turns out gesturally they were more distinctive, and that is some of the analysis that our musicologist collaborator did to explain what value the video brought to this. Okay, and just to tell you that we had 3 singers, but after that we actually also set up a contract with the studio in Pune, and we have now many more singers, 11 singers, because we got artists to the studio and did the same raga recordings and also did all this tracking. So we have more data now, and this is another really interesting line of work. Okay. So that's all for me. Sorry, I had to hurry over something, but I'll be glad to take any questions in the remaining 2-3 minutes. Sure, sure. In fact, when I was coming here, I thought, okay, now it's my turn to stand here in the firing range. And then, but the whole afternoon, I think everyone was sleeping. So my nervousness was totally misplaced. I got no questions.
I suppose film music is very widely used, probably more than even classical music. So any attempt to structure them or quantify them or group them must be harder.
Right, but I think a lot of what we call film music and so on is like popular music, and there is a lot of convergence. The nature of popular music globally is it's very similar to Western pop and other pop, and so I'm not saying there are no distinctions. Yeah, so I think that overall is like more studied. Yeah.
And even, madam, there is what is called we attach old Hindi music and new Hindi music.
Correct, correct.
The old Hindi music like Ceylon music that we used to hear.
Right.
Similar, so there is some lot of melodic aspect.
Correct.
Them are related to.
Right. No, they have, more strong classical foundations than more recent, pop music.
And there will not be any problem on patenting or copyrights, etc. Old songs can always be retrieved.
50 years old, yeah. If they are more than 50 years old, yes.
I was thinking like when we measure the oscillations of the, glottal flow, I mean, the glottis, vocal folds. So we call that as a fundamental frequency. And we also refer it as or pitch frequency like that sometimes. F naught or pitch. Now in the perception, when we don't see the periodicity in the signal, but still we say that as a pitch basically. So there is like, I was thinking as a kind of discrepancy from the measured pitch versus the perceived pitch basically.
Okay, so
what is
music,
your opinion?
right. No, see, as far as music goes, it's always periodic. See, those other psychoacoustic phenomena which have a pitch but are not a period are probably very narrow band noise, because that can also elicit a sense of pitch by passing noise through a very narrow band filter. But then the waveform is not periodic, right? But musical instruments, by their very structure, or even the vibrating glottis, it's necessarily periodic. Maybe the local periodicity is very restricted and it is changing from, pitch pulse to epoch, it can change, for example. Correct?
Yes. And the second question was that, do you also see the need for having a better signal processing tool in terms of like resolving these nodes? As I was mentioning to other lecture also, that the use of constant Q transform to then the spectrogram, like to resolve those nodes. It was proposed for Western classical, Western music,
No, but that's all built on, based on fundamental properties of hearing. So it holds for all music that, some kind of logarithmic, transformation of the spectrum would be better.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, ma'am, if you could please enlighten on the relevance of the pseudo transcription on retrieval tasks, because we have been talking about it's a difficult task to do a matching of the human annotation with the melodic transcription, but like we also had managed to do some motive detection through edit distances by symbolic representation. Which is kind of a pseudo representation of transcription. But that is helpful for the task. So if you want to.
Right. So that pseudo representation could be something like that intermediate representation. Correct. But what we are thinking is that maybe this ultimate task of putting it in Markandeya notation is, is also could be quite interesting, but all of these could help in that. So you don't have to struggle with all these continuous shape, because that pseudo transcription already gives us some smaller space.
Yeah.
Right?
We had also tried some vector quantization by fitting in polynomials. So because many of the instances where there is an intended notation versus something with gamak. Like for example, sa re ga, it can be some like stepwise function, and now when I say it's not So for that, the transcription parameters has to be tuned differently. Now, if we can find the low pass variations of that, it can find that. So we have tried bunch of different techniques to have different low pass and high pass signals where ornaments were kind of modeled as a superposition. So it's like the intended signal is the stepwise function, but it was added superimposed with the ornamentation of a gamak. And that was also insightful. So we tried different methods for, we used to call it pseudo transcription because we didn't want to capture the word transcription. It's a very loaded term. But yeah, that was very insightful. So
Correct. So now if we can just tie it to this ultimate output, that would be really very useful. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Suggesting psychoacoustics for the purpose of replication or a student-teacher relationship. So I think it's a great idea, I feel. I mean, just on the extempore, it's a great idea to make it parametric and to see how many parameters, maybe a third order polynomial, fourth order polynomial may be good. So just four-dimensional vector in that space, if we can do a clustering and represent a certain good number of ragas, fantastic, I think that's a good idea. I mean, if you have results, please publish it. Or patent it. I'm sure there are people to patent it also. There is value. I mean, perceptual quantization, you see the value. It has revolutionized our entire music distribution, listening, and everything. Quantization was very well known. Perceptual quantization of Fraunhofer Institute, Brandenburg. Fantastic, right?
It's an intermediate level of transcription where we convert the continuous speech contour to a symbolic representation.
But that symbolic need not be medieval.
Okay. It can be stepwise, linear, with some transients modeled as polynomials. Now that is not exactly matching this output notation, but that is an intermediate representation we can use for retrieval. For example, we had used the Smith-Waterman algorithm, which is sequence matching. It's 11 distance. Different parameters we could do a retrieval system for very long.
Like which matters like sequences of melodic pitches rather than
So we actually wanted to match contour shapes, but it was getting very unwieldy, right? Because every 10 millisecond is another pitch value. So we sort of condense that to a sequence of symbols, which is drawn from a smaller set, right? But
do you think like MIDI, like if we look at like MIDI is in a way like musical quantization, right? It's
so MIDI in quantization, what sir was exactly mentioning. So we were adapting the quantization into a parametric space with knowledge of music. So it's incorporating knowledge into the data-driven system. So MIDI is a very standard quantization. But we were defining the quantization adaptively. So the purpose was, in this transform space, the variability is less, but it still holds the identity.
Okay. Yeah.
Like for example, right. Yeah. For example, ma'am was showing this different shape realizations of the same Gagapa phrase. Now, this was actual pitch contour. But if we transcribe into that pseudo transcription parametric space, the variations will start looking more similar in that transform space. So in the retrieval scenario, we want that, right? So that MIDI representation sometimes loses identity. Because it does quantize to certain. Yeah, exactly. But we are transforming to a space which is controlled, where the variability is still there, but it's reduced. Like for example, now if you ask a musician, they will say, okay, this is the same thing, just with gum up without gum up. but we don't have a system with flag of gamma. Like the same notation, you flag, turn on gamma flag, and we don't have that system. So the intention was to do something of that sort. Like having the intended melodic variations, which we call a low pass variation, versus a embellished variation. So we've also enabled us to model to some extent what is the embellishment appropriate for what kind of stage in a concert. Because now when amateur begin, yeah, now this mode is not quantifiable. It's also context dependent. Maybe you have done something else which demands some certain other embellishments to be realized. So if there is any correlation between these things, so once you have a different vocabulary of these items, you can have more like dimension to explore.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, we can break for tea. Yeah.